Some promises we make as children stay with us our whole lives, even when everyone else forgets. Sometimes the simplest words spoken by the smallest voices carry the power to change everything. In Lancaster County, 68-year-old Elias worked his Amish farm alone, the silence heavy where his wife's laughter once filled the kitchen and his children's voices once echoed through the barn. The bank notices piled up on his table, and his hands weren't as strong as they used to be. He was ready to give up. Then one morning, a car pulled into his driveway. A young woman stepped out, her eyes nervous but determined. "You probably don't remember me," she said softly, "but 17 years ago, I promised I'd come back to help. On your farm." Elias stared at her, memories flooding back of a little girl with pigtails who had stolen his heart one summer. What brought Lucy back after all these years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Elias Stoltzfus had always believed that some moments in life were carved by the Almighty's own hand, designed to echo through the years like ripples on still water. Standing on his porch that morning, watching the young woman emerge from her car with uncertain steps, he felt the weight of 17 summers pressing against his chest. The sun painted the Pennsylvania countryside in shades of gold and amber, the same light that had blessed his land for nearly 4 decades. His weathered hands gripped the porch rail as recognition dawned, not of her face, which had matured beyond his memory, but of something deeper. The careful way she closed the car door, the slight tilt of her head as she surveyed his property, the determined set of her shoulders, despite the nervousness in her eyes. "Lucy Brennan," he said quietly, his voice carrying across the morning. Stillness. Her face brightened with relief and something close to joy. "You do remember." How could he forget? That summer of 2006 had been one of the last truly abundant seasons before the world began to shift beneath his feet. Sarah had been 51 then, her dark hair just beginning to silver at the temples, her laughter still ringing through their kitchen every morning as she prepared breakfast for their family. The corn had grown tall and straight, the tomatoes heavy on their vines, and the dairy cows had given rich, creamy milk that brought premium prices at market. Lucy's family had been traveling through Lancaster County, tourists seeking a glimpse of the simple life that drew thousands of visitors each year. But unlike most who passed through, snapping pictures and buying trinkets, the Brennans had stopped at his roadside stand, not just to purchase fresh vegetables, but to ask genuine questions about his way of life. Lucy had been 7 years old, then a sprite of a child with auburn pigtails and curious green eyes that seemed to absorb everything around her. While her parents talked with Sarah about canning methods and her teenage brother sulked in their rental car, Lucy had wandered toward the barn where Elias was mending harness leather. "What are you doing?" she had asked, settling cross-legged on the hay-strewn floor beside his workbench. "Fixing what's broken," Elias had replied, his hands never pausing in their careful stitching. "This old harness has served our family for 20 years, but leather gets worn. A little care, some strong thread, and it'll serve 20 more. She had watched in fascination as his thick fingers worked the needle through the tough material. "My dad throws things away when they break. Mom says it's easier to buy new." "Different folks have different ways," Elias had said gently. "We believe in tending what we have, making it last. There's wisdom in old things, if you know how to listen to them." Lucy had stayed there for an hour, asking questions about everything, from the purpose of the various tools hanging on his workshop walls to why his horses didn't wear the metal shoes she'd seen on other farms. Elias had found himself charmed by her earnest curiosity and lack of the self-consciousness that often made English children awkward around Amish folk. "Can I help?" she had asked when he moved on to repairing a broken gate latch. "Little hands can be mighty useful," he had agreed, showing her how to hold the pieces steady while he secured them with wire. Over the 3 days her family had stayed at a nearby bed and breakfast, Lucy had returned each morning, drawn to the rhythm of farm, life like a moth to flame. Sarah had taken to setting an extra place at their breakfast table, delighting in the child's enthusiasm for fresh eggs and homemade jam. Lucy had helped gather eggs from the henhouse, her small hands careful with each treasure. She had learned to milk Bessie, their gentlest cow, her tongue poking out in concentration as she worked to master the technique. But it was the quiet moments that had forged the deepest connection. Sitting on the porch swing in the evening, watching fireflies dance over the pasture, Lucy would pepper Elias with questions about his faith, his family, his contentment with a life so different from what she knew. "Don't you ever want to watch TV?" she had asked one evening, her legs swinging as she worked to keep the swing moving. "The sunset puts on a different show every night," Elias had replied. "Never the same twice, always beautiful. That's entertainment enough for me." "Don't. You want to go places, see things? I've seen the most important things right here," he had said, gesturing toward the fields where Sarah was hanging laundry on the line, their children playing nearby. "A man can spend his whole life searching for what I wake up to every morning, on Their last evening, Lucy had helped Sarah braid wheat stalks for a decorative centerpiece, her small fingers working slowly but determinedly to master the pattern. The kitchen had been filled with the warm smell of baking bread and the gentle hum of women's conversation, Sarah sharing stories of her own children, Lucy talking about school and her dreams of becoming a veterinarian. "I want to take care of animals like you take care of your farm," Lucy had explained, her face serious with childhood conviction. "I want to help things grow and get better." "That's a fine calling," Sarah had assured her. "The world needs people who understand that. Caring for living things is sacred work." As the family prepared to leave the next morning, Lucy had lingered on the porch, her small suitcase forgotten by the car as her parents called for her to hurry. Elias had knelt to her eye level, this child who had brought such unexpected joy to their ordinary days. "Thank you for teaching me so much," she had said solemnly, then thrown her arms around his neck in an impulsive hug that had squeezed his heart. "You taught me things too," he had replied truthfully. Through her eyes, he had seen his farm anew, not just as the backdrop of his daily routine, but as something worth wondering about, worth cherishing. "I'll help on your farm when I grow up," she had declared, with the fierce certainty only children possessed. "I promise." Elias had smiled and patted her shoulder. "You'll have your own life to tend by then, little one, but you'll always be welcome." "Yeah." She had shaken her head stubbornly. "I mean it. I'll come back and help you." Then she had skipped to the car, waving through the back window until they disappeared around the bend in the county road. Elias had found himself oddly bereft, the farm seeming too quiet without her bright chatter and eager questions. Sarah had saved the drawing Lucy left behind, a crayon sketch of a stick figure with auburn pigtails standing next to a much taller figure in a black hat, both holding what appeared to be farm tools. At the bottom, in careful 7-year-old printing, Lucy had written, "Me and Mr. Elias fixing things together." Sarah had pressed it between the pages of their family Bible, laughing at Elias's surprised expression. "Some promises are meant to be kept," she had said with the mysterious wisdom wives sometimes possessed. That child meant every word. The years that followed had tested that wisdom severely. Their son Daniel had left the community at 18, drawn to the English world's promises of excitement and advancement. Their daughter Hannah had married and moved to Ohio. The harvests had grown smaller, the bills larger. Sarah had fallen ill 3 years ago. Cancer that moved through her body with ruthless efficiency, despite their prayers and the community's unwavering support. Through the long nights sitting beside her hospital bed, Elias had often thought of that summer with Lucy. Sarah, even in her pain, would smile when he mentioned the child's promise. "She'll come," Sarah had whispered during her final days. "When you need her most, she'll come." Elias had dismissed it. as the kind of hope dying people clung to, the need to believe in connections that transcended loss. But Sarah had been right about many things during their 38 years together. Perhaps she had been right about this too, now standing face to face with the woman that little girl had become. Elias felt the past and present colliding with almost physical force. Lucy was taller than he had expected, her auburn hair now worn in a neat bun at the nape of her neck. Her green eyes held depths that spoke of experience both bitter and sweet. She wore simple clothes, jeans and a button-down shirt that suggested practical sensibility rather than fashion. "I know this must seem strange," she continued, her voice carrying a slight tremor, "showing up out of nowhere after all this time." "Strange things have a way of making the most sense," Elias replied, stepping down from the porch. "The question is, what brings you back to an old man's failing farm?" Lucy's composure wavered slightly. "I heard about Mrs. Sarah. I'm so sorry. For your loss." The mention of his wife's name brought the familiar ache to his chest, but somehow hearing it from Lucy's lips made it bearable rather than sharp. "She remembered you fondly, often spoke of that summer you spent with us." "It changed me," Lucy said simply. "I've thought about this place, about both of you, more times than I could count over the years. When life got complicated, I'd remember the peace I felt here." Elias studied her face, noting the fine lines around her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and the careful way she held herself, as if protecting against further hurt. "Life has a way of getting complicated, doesn't it? More than I ever imagined. When I was 7, Lucy managed a small smile, "but I meant what I said all those years ago. I came back to help." The morning sun climbed higher, casting longer shadows across the farmyard that had once bustled with activity, but now showed signs of one man's struggle against time and circumstance. The barn needed paint. Several fence posts leaned at precarious. Engles and weeds grew tall around the machinery that Elias could no longer maintain as he once had. "I appreciate the thought," Elias said carefully, "but I'm not sure what help you think you can offer. Farming's hard work, and this old place—" "I'm a veterinarian," Lucy interrupted. "I know animals, I know land, and I know what it means to care for something that can't care for itself." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the property with professional assessment. "And I know what it's like to lose the most important thing in your life." Something in her tone made Elias look at her more closely. Beneath the determination and nervous energy, he recognized a familiar shadow, the look of someone who had walked through grief's valley and emerged changed by the journey. "Well then," he said quietly, "I suppose we should see what there is to see." The tour of the farm revealed what Elias had tried to hide from himself for months. Through Lucy's eyes, he saw not just the inevitable wear of time, but the deeper signs of a man overwhelmed by circumstances beyond his control. The dairy barn that had once housed 30 head of cattle now sheltered only 8, their stalls showing gaps like missing teeth. The equipment shed contained machinery that hadn't run properly in 2 seasons, parts too expensive to replace on a dwindling income. Lucy walked beside him in respectful silence, her trained eye taking in details he hoped she wouldn't notice. The slight limp in Bertha, his oldest cow, the way the henhouse door hung crooked on its hinges, the pasture fence that sagged in 3 places, held up more by habit than proper tension. "When did you last have the herd tested?" she asked quietly as they passed the cattle gathered in the shade of an old oak. "Spring testing," Elias replied, then added with reluctant honesty, "Dr. Matthews from town handles that. Costs more each year." Lucy nodded, her gaze lingering on Bertha. "She's favoring her left rear leg. Probably an abscess in her hoof. Nothing serious if it's caught early." They walked on, past the vegetable garden, where Sarah's careful rows had given way to a practical but uninspired patch of corn and beans. Lucy paused at the fence, her fingers tracing the weathered wood where paint had long since surrendered to Pennsylvania weather. I need to tell you why I'm really here, she said suddenly, her voice carrying a weight that made Elias stop walking. He turned to face her, noting how she seemed to gather herself before speaking, like someone preparing to step into cold water. I'm divorced, she began, the words coming carefully. 2 years now. My practice in Colorado. I lost it in the settlement. My husband was a lawyer, and he was very good at what he did. The bitter edge in her voice spoke of betrayals that went deeper than financial loss. I'm sorry, Elias said simply. In his world, marriage was a covenant meant to last until death parted husband and wife. Divorce was rare, painful, and carried its own kind of grief. I came here because I needed to remember what it felt like to be somewhere that mattered, Lucy continued. That summer when I was 7, this was the first place I ever felt truly useful. Not just entertained or indulged, but actually needed. They had reached the old mailbox where the farm's driveway met the county road. Lucy's rental car sat beside his battered pickup truck, the contrast between them stark. Hers sleek and temporary, his practical and permanent as the land itself. The thing is, Lucy said, turning to face the farmhouse with its whitewashed walls and green shutters, I have nowhere else I need to be right now. My license transfers easily enough between states, and there are always animals that need care. She paused, her voice growing quieter. And sometimes people who need caring for too. Elias studied her profile, seeing something of the determined child in the woman's set jaw. Lucy, I appreciate what you're offering, but you don't understand the situation here. This isn't just about needing help with chores. As if summoned by his words, a white sedan pulled into the driveway, dust rising from its tires. Elias felt his stomach tighten as he recognized the car and its driver, Tom Fletcher from Farmers Trust Bank, a man whose visits never brought. Good news. Fletcher emerged from his car with the brisk efficiency of someone conducting unpleasant business. He was younger than Elias by 20 years, dressed in a pressed suit that seemed out of place against the rural backdrop. His smile was professional and sympathetic in the way that preceded difficult conversations. Morning, Elias, Fletcher said, then nodded politely toward Lucy. I hope I'm not interrupting. Tom Fletcher, meet Lucy Brennan, Elias said, his voice carefully neutral. Lucy, this is Mr. Fletcher from the bank. Lucy stepped forward, extending her hand with professional confidence. Pleased to meet you. Fletcher shook her hand, his eyes curious. Brennan, are you family? A friend, Lucy replied simply, but she moved slightly closer to Elias in a gesture of solidarity that wasn't lost on either man. Well, I'm glad Elias has company, Fletcher said, then reached into his jacket pocket. I'm afraid I have some paperwork that needs attention. The foreclosure notice was formal and final, typed on official letterhead, with signatures and seals that carried the weight of law. Elias took the document with hands that trembled slightly, though whether from age or emotion, Lucy couldn't tell. 60 days, Fletcher said gently. I've held this off as long as I could, Elias. The board was very clear about the timeline. Lucy watched Elias scan the document, saw his shoulders sag almost imperceptibly as the reality settled over him. This wasn't just about an aging man needing help with farm chores. This was about losing everything he had built across 4 decades of honest work. I understand, Elias said quietly, folding the notice with careful precision. Thank you for all your patience, Tom. Fletcher cleared his throat uncomfortably. There might be options. If you could bring the account current, or if there was some significant change in your financial situation. What would that look like? Lucy interrupted, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to asking direct questions. Fletcher glanced at Elias, who nodded for him to continue. The arrears total about 18,000. With penalties and fees, call it 20, and that would just bring it current. There would still be ongoing monthly payments. Lucy absorbed this information with the same clinical assessment she might use to evaluate an injured animal. The numbers were significant, but not impossible, if approached strategically. I see, she said, and the monthly payments, 800, plus insurance and taxes, probably 1,000 all in. After Fletcher left, promising to call if any alternatives presented themselves, Lucy and Elias stood in the farmyard silence. The foreclosure notice seemed to cast a shadow over everything, making the needed repairs and maintenance appear not just daunting, but pointless. "Now you understand," Elias said finally. "This isn't about having help with chores. This is about a foolish old man who held on too long to something he couldn't maintain." Lucy turned to face him, her green eyes blazing with the same fierce determination he remembered from her childhood. "No, what I understand is that you've been carrying this burden alone, but you don't have to anymore. Lucy, you don't realize what you're saying. I have money," she said bluntly. "Not a fortune, but enough. The divorce settlement left me with some assets, and I've been living carefully. More importantly, I have skills this farm needs and time to use them." Elias shook his head. "I can't accept charity." "It's not charity," Lucy interrupted. "It's a partnership. You have land, knowledge, and 40 years of experience. I have veterinary training, some capital, and apparently a childhood promise to keep." She smiled, the expression transforming her serious face. "Besides, you're not getting rid of me that easily. I checked into the bed and breakfast in town this morning. I'm staying for at least 2 weeks, whether you want help or not." They stood facing each other in the afternoon sun, two people from different worlds bound by threads spun 17 years earlier. Elias saw the child who had sat beside his workbench asking endless questions, but also the woman who had survived her own losses and emerged with compassion intact. "The community won't understand," he said slowly. "An English woman working alongside an Amish man, there will be talk." "Let them talk," Lucy replied. "People always find something to discuss. The question is whether you're willing to let me. Try to help save something worth saving." Elias looked across his land, the fields that had fed his family, the barn where he had taught his children to work with their hands, the house where Sarah's presence still seemed to linger in every room. Then he looked at Lucy, seeing not just an answer to immediate problems, but perhaps something deeper, a chance to honor both the past and the possibility of a different future. 2 weeks, he said finally. "We'll see what 2 weeks can accomplish." Lucy's smile was radiant. 2 weeks is plenty of time to get started. As they walked back toward the house, neither of them noticed the curtain flutter in the window of the neighboring farmhouse, where Rebecca Yoder had been watching with great interest. By evening, news of the Englishwoman's arrival would have traveled through the Amish community with the efficiency of a well-organized prayer chain. Some conversations were just beginning. Dawn came early to Lancaster County, and Lucy discovered that Elias rose with it as naturally as breathing. She had set her phone alarm for 5:30, determined not to be the city person who slept while farm work waited. But she found him, already in the barn when she arrived at 6, his lantern casting long shadows as he moved between the stalls. "Morning," she called softly, not wanting to startle the cattle. Elias looked up from where he was examining Bertha's hoof, his weathered face showing surprise and something that might have been approval. "You're early. I'm on farm time now," Lucy replied, rolling up her sleeves. "Let me look at that hoof." She knelt beside the old cow, her hands gentle but confident as she lifted the affected leg. Bertha shifted restlessly, but Lucy's quiet voice and steady touch soon calmed her. Years of veterinary practice had taught her that animals responded to certainty more than anything else. "Definitely an abscess," she confirmed, probing carefully around the swollen area. "We need to drain it and pack it with antibiotic." "Do you have any drawing salve?" Elias shook his head. "Haven't needed it in some time. I can pick some up in town later. For now, let's soak it in warm water with Epsom salt if you have it." They worked together in companionable silence, Lucy providing medical expertise while Elias offered the patient handling that came from decades of experience. Bertha seemed to sense their combined concern, standing quietly as they tended to her. "Injury? She's been with you a long time," Lucy observed, noting the cow's graying muzzle and the patient way she bore their ministrations. 12 years this spring, Elias replied. Sarah named her after my grandmother, said she had the same stubborn streak and sweet disposition. Lucy smiled at that, filing away another small piece of the life that had shaped this place. The herd's smaller than it used to be. Hard to maintain numbers when you can't afford to feed them properly, Elias admitted with the reluctant honesty that seemed to characterize all their conversations. Had to sell off the young stock last year. They moved on to the milking, where Lucy's inexperience showed immediately. The gentle technique she had learned as a 7-year-old had not translated into adult competency, and Daisy, Elias's most patient cow, made her disapproval known with shuffling feet and swishing tail. Steady pressure, Elias demonstrated, his large hands working with practiced rhythm. She can tell if you're uncertain, Lucy tried again, focusing on the motion rather than her own self-consciousness. Gradually, the milk began to flow steadily into the bucket, and she felt a small surge of triumph at mastering this basic skill. It's like riding a bicycle, she said, then caught herself. Sorry, I know you don't. I know what bicycles are, Elias said with dry humor. And you're right. Some things the hands remember even when the mind forgets. The morning progressed with a series of small tasks that revealed both their capabilities and limitations. Lucy's medical knowledge proved valuable when treating a minor cut on one of the younger steers, but her attempts to repair a broken feed trough resulted more in frustration than progress. Elias moved with the efficiency of long practice, but Lucy noticed how he favored his left shoulder and took frequent breaks that he tried to disguise as thoughtful pauses. The walking stick leaning against the barn wall caught her attention, hand-carved, with intricate detail, clearly a piece made with love and skill. When Elias reached for it after a particularly strenuous task, she understood it wasn't just decoration. Your father made that? She asked. Elias nodded, running his thumb along the smooth wood. Took him most of a winter. Said a man's tools should last longer than the man who uses them. He paused, considering the stick with the reverence due to meaningful objects. Some days I feel his hands guiding mine through the wood. By mid-morning, they had established a working rhythm that played to their respective strengths. Lucy handled anything requiring medical assessment or treatment, while Elias focused on repairs and maintenance tasks that demanded experience over physical strength. The arrangement felt natural, though Lucy was acutely aware of curious glances. From the neighboring farms, their first real conflict arose over the chicken coop, where Lucy discovered several birds showing signs of mites. Her suggestion to treat the entire flock with modern parasiticides met with polite but firm resistance. We use diatomaceous earth and wood ash, Elias explained, natural remedies that don't leave chemicals in the meat or eggs. But the commercial treatments are more effective, Lucy countered. You'll clear the infestation faster and prevent reoccurrence. At what cost? Elias asked quietly. To the birds, to the soil, to the people who eat what we produce? It was their first direct confrontation over methodology, and Lucy felt the weight of cultural differences pressing against their growing partnership. In her world, efficiency and effectiveness took precedence over tradition. In his, the long-term health of land and community outweighed immediate solutions. I'm not trying to change everything you do, she said carefully. But some modern methods exist because they work better, and some old methods exist because they work in harmony with God's design, Elias replied with equal care. The challenge is knowing which is which. They compromised on a combination approach. The traditional methods Elias preferred, supplemented by selective use of treatments that met his standards for natural safety. It was a small victory for both perspectives, and Lucy found herself respecting his unwillingness to abandon principles for convenience. Lunch was eaten on the porch, simple sandwiches washed down with cold milk from their morning's work. The early June heat was building, and both welcomed the shade and the chance to rest. Lucy noticed how Elias seemed to relax in these quiet moments, his shoulders losing their tension as they sat in comfortable silence. "This must be strange for you," she said eventually, "having someone disrupt your routine." "Strange, yes," Elias agreed, "but not unwelcome. The silence gets heavy sometimes, especially in the morning when Sarah used to—" He stopped himself, the sentence hanging unfinished. "When she used to what?" "Sing," he said simply. "She sang while she worked, hymns mostly, but sometimes old songs her mother taught her. The barn always felt more alive when she was there." Lucy thought about this, picturing the mornings when this place had been filled with family sounds instead of the careful quiet that now defined it. What was her favorite? "Be thou my vision," Elias replied without hesitation. Said it reminded her that everything we could see was just a shadow of what we couldn't. They sat quietly for a moment, both contemplating the wisdom in those words. Then Lucy surprised them both by beginning to hum the melody, her voice soft but clear in the afternoon air. Elias joined her on the second verse, his deep bass harmonizing with her lighter tone. When the song ended, they sat in the kind of silence that felt full rather than empty. Lucy realized that for the first time in months she felt genuinely peaceful. Not the anxious quiet of someone avoiding problems, but the deep contentment that came from meaningful work shared with someone who understood its value. 2 weeks might not be enough time," she said quietly. Elias glanced at her, noting the change in her voice from uncertainty to something approaching resolve. "Time has a way of showing us what we need to know." As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, they returned to work with renewed purpose, each task building trust and competence between them. The farm's needs were many, but for the first time in months, Elias felt hope that they might be manageable with the right help. Neither of them noticed Rebecca Yoder's continued observation from her kitchen window, or the thoughtful expression on her face as she watched two very different people discover their common ground. The third day brought rain, a gentle but persistent Pennsylvania drizzle that turned the barnyard to mud and drove them indoors. Lucy found Elias in the farmhouse kitchen, sitting at a worn wooden table with a cup of coffee and a pile of papers that looked suspiciously like bills. The room carried the faint scent of cinnamon and old wood, homey despite its obvious emptiness. "Morning?" she said, shaking droplets from her jacket. "Looks like we're grounded today." Elias glanced up from his paperwork, quickly gathering the bills into a neat stack. "Rain's good for the crops, gives us time for indoor work." Lucy's eyes swept the kitchen, taking in details she hadn't noticed during her brief visits. The counters were clean but sparse, lacking the small touches that spoke of a woman's presence. A single-place setting sat in the dish drainer. The window over the sink, which should have been bright with curtains and potted herbs, showed only plain glass and an empty sill. Then she saw it, a wooden recipe box sitting on a shelf beside the stove, its surface worn smooth by countless hands. Something about it drew her attention, perhaps the way it sat slightly apart from other items, as if it held special significance. "That was Sarah's," Elias said, following her gaze. "Her mother's before that, and her grandmother's before that. 3 generations of cooking wisdom in one box. May I?" Lucy asked, approaching the shelf with reverence. Elias nodded, his expression softening. "She always said recipes weren't just instructions, but stories. Each one carried memories of the women who wrote them down." Lucy lifted the box carefully, surprised by its weight. The wood was dark with age, the corners rounded by years of handling. Inside, she found dozens of index cards written in different hands, some in fading pencil, others in careful ink, a few in the precise script of someone who took pride in beautiful penmanship. "Apple butter, grandmother's way," she read from one card. "Beef stew for harvest crews." Another, "Birthday cake, Danny's favorite." Each recipe included not just ingredients and instructions, but small notes. "Add extra vanilla when it's cold outside. Serve with fresh cream from Bessie. Always sing while stirring. Makes the bread rise higher." She wasn't joking about that last one, Elias said with a small smile. Sarah insisted music made everything taste better. Said joy was the most important ingredient in any recipe. Lucy continued reading, fascinated by the glimpses into a life lived fully and shared generously. These weren't just recipes. They were a roadmap to creating a home that nourished both body and soul. "When did you last have a proper meal?" she asked gently. "Not just sandwiches or whatever's easiest." Elias was quiet for a long moment. "Been eating simple since Sarah passed. Seems wrong somehow to make her favorite dishes just for myself." What if you weren't eating alone? The suggestion hung in the air between them, carrying implications neither was quite ready to examine. Lucy felt herself blushing, wondering if she'd overstepped some invisible boundary. But Elias's expression was thoughtful, rather than uncomfortable. "I suppose that would be different," he said slowly. "Though I'm not much of a cook these days." "I am," Lucy said with more confidence than she felt. "At least I used to be. My ex-husband preferred restaurants, said home cooking was old-fashioned." The words came out more bitter than she intended, revealing wounds still tender to the touch. Elias studied her face, seeing something of his own grief reflected there. "Sarah always said the best meals were cooked by people who understood that feeding others was an act of love." "Then let's love somebody today," Lucy said impulsively, then immediately felt heat rise to her cheeks at her own boldness. "I mean, let's cook something from her recipes, for both of us." They spent the morning exploring the kitchen together, Lucy learning the locations of pots and pans, while Elias shared the stories behind various tools and implements. The cast-iron skillet had been Sarah's wedding gift from her mother. The wooden spoons were carved by Elias himself during their first winter together. Each item carried history, purpose, and the patina of countless meals prepared with care. Lucy chose a recipe for chicken and dumplings, remembering her grandmother's version from childhood visits. As she worked, following Sarah's careful instructions, she found herself humming unconsciously, the same hymn they had shared on the porch the day before. "She would have liked you," Elias said suddenly, watching Lucy's hands work the dumpling dough with growing confidence. Sarah had a gift for seeing the heart of people, past all the surface differences. "I would have liked to know her better," Lucy replied honestly. "That summer when I was 7, she made me feel like I belonged somewhere. I didn't realize how rare that was until much later." The kitchen filled with the rich aromas of simmering chicken and vegetables, creating an atmosphere of warmth and anticipation that had been missing from the house for too long. Lucy found herself relaxing in ways she hadn't expected, the simple act of cooking in a place that welcomed nourishment working its own kind of healing. "Tell me about your marriage," Elias said quietly as they waited for the dumplings to cook through. It wasn't prying, more like the gentle question of someone who understood that some stories needed telling. Lucy leaned against the counter, choosing her words carefully. "I thought I wanted sophistication. David was everything my small town. Upbringing wasn't educated, successful, cosmopolitan. He made me feel like I was becoming someone more important than I'd ever imagined. But he also made me feel like who I was naturally wasn't good enough. The way I talked, the things I enjoyed, my tendency to get my hands dirty, all of it needed improving." She paused, stirring the pot unnecessarily. "I lost myself trying to become someone he could love properly." Elias nodded with the understanding of someone who had witnessed love in its truest form. "Sarah used to say that real love makes you more yourself, not less. I'm learning that now," Lucy said softly. "Being here, working with the animals, using my hands for something that matters, I feel like I'm remembering who I used to be." They ate in companionable silence, both marveling at how food prepared with care tasted different from mere sustenance. The dumplings were perfectly light, the chicken tender, the broth rich with the flavors that only time and patience could create. "This was one of her best recipes," Elias said, his voice thick with memory. "She made it every time someone in the community was sick or grieving. Said comfort food should actually bring comfort." "It does," Lucy agreed, feeling something inside her chest loosen and warm. I'd forgotten what it felt like to cook for someone who appreciated it. As afternoon wore on and the rain continued its gentle drumming against the windows, they found themselves talking more freely than they had since her arrival. Lucy shared stories of her veterinary training, the satisfaction of healing injured animals, and the heartbreak of losing patience despite her best efforts. Elias spoke of the rhythms of farming, the way each season brought its own challenges, and rewards, and the deep contentment that came from working in partnership with the land rather than trying to conquer it. "I've been thinking about your situation with the bank," Lucy said as they cleaned up together, falling naturally into a rhythm of washing and drying that felt practiced despite being new. "Not much to think about," Elias replied, but his tone was resigned rather than bitter. "Numbers are numbers. Sometimes there are more numbers than the obvious ones." Lucy said carefully, "I'd like to look at your books if you'd let me. Sometimes an outside perspective sees possibilities that familiarity misses." Elias considered this, recognizing both the practical sense of her offer and the trust it would require to accept it. Finally, he nodded. Sarah always said 2 heads were better than 1, especially when one of them belonged to someone who cared about the outcome. As evening settled over the farm, Lucy realized that she had spent an entire day without thinking once about her old life, her divorce, or the uncertain future that had driven her to this place. Instead, she felt grounded in the present moment, useful in ways that had nothing to do with professional credentials or social status. Some kinds of healing, she thought, came not from moving forward, but from remembering what had always been true. The 4th morning brought unexpected visitors. Lucy was in the barn, treating a cut on one of the young steers when she heard the rumble of a diesel truck in the driveway, followed by car doors slamming and voices she didn't recognize. Through the barn's open door, she saw Elias emerge from the house, his posture stiffening as he recognized his guests. A man in his 30s climbed from the truck's driver's seat, his jeans and button-down shirt marking him as someone who had traded plain clothes for English fashion. Despite the modern dress, his features were unmistakably Amish, the strong jaw and steady eyes that mirrored Elias's own face. A woman followed, blonde and clearly uncomfortable with the rural setting, picking her way carefully across the uneven ground in shoes unsuited for farm work. Lucy continued her work with the steer, but her attention was divided between the animals' needs and the tension she could sense building in the farmyard. This had to be Daniel, Elias's son, who had left the community, the one whose absence had contributed to the farm's current struggles. "Hello, Dad," Daniel's voice carried across the morning air, formal and careful. "Daniel." Elias's reply was equally restrained. "Wasn't expecting you. We were passing through on our way to Philadelphia. Thought we'd stop by." Daniel gestured toward his companion. "This is Jennifer, my fiancée. Jen, this is my father." Lucy watched the awkward introductions through the barn door, noting how Jennifer's smile seemed forced and how Daniel's hands remained firmly in his pockets rather than reaching out for the embrace that might have been natural between father and son in a different world. "We heard about the farm," Daniel continued, his voice carrying an edge that suggested this wasn't a casual visit. "About the bank notice." Elias's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Word travels fast. The community talks, Dad. People are concerned, are they?" There was something in Elias's tone that made Lucy set down her medical supplies and move closer to the barn door, ready to intervene if needed, though she wasn't sure how. Daniel's fiancée looked increasingly uncomfortable, glancing between the 2 men as if sensing undercurrents she couldn't understand. "Maybe I should wait in the truck," she murmured. "No need," Daniel said firmly, then turned back to his father. "We came to make you an offer." Lucy saw Elias's shoulders square, the defensive posture of a man who had learned to expect disappointment from this particular source. "What kind of offer?" "I've been talking to some developers in Lancaster. This location, with the right improvements, could be worth significant money. Tourist destination, maybe a bed and breakfast operation. The authentic Amish experience that city people pay premium prices for. The words hit the morning air like stones thrown into still water, creating ripples of shock and disturbance. Lucy felt her own anger rising on Elias's behalf, but forced herself to remain quiet. This was family business, however painful to witness. "You want me to sell the farm to developers," Elias said slowly, as if making sure he understood correctly. "I want you to be realistic about your options," Daniel replied, his voice taking on the practiced cadence of someone accustomed to making persuasive presentations. "You can't maintain this place alone. The community helps, but there are limits to what neighbors can do. This way, you'd have enough money to buy something smaller, more manageable. And what happens to 4 generations of Stoltzfus family land?" Daniel's expression hardened slightly. "It becomes a business that employs local people and brings tourism, revenue to the area. Dad, sentiment doesn't pay bills or put food on the table." That was when Lucy stepped from the barn, unable to remain silent any longer. Both men turned toward her, Daniel's eyes widening in surprise at the sight of an Englishwoman emerging from his father's workspace. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said politely but firmly, "but I couldn't help overhearing. I'm Lucy Brennan." She extended her hand to Daniel, noting how his grip was strong but brief, professionally courteous, rather than genuinely welcoming. "Daniel Stoltzfus," he replied, his eyes already assessing her with the quick evaluation of someone trying to understand her role in his father's life. "Are you—" "A friend," Lucy said simply. "I'm helping with the farm work." Jennifer stepped forward with visible relief at having another woman in the conversation. "That's wonderful that Elias has help. This place must be so much work for one person." "It is," Lucy agreed, then looked directly at Daniel. "But it's work worth doing. Your father has built something remarkable here. Not just a farm, but a legacy. It would be a shame to see it turned into a tourist attraction." Daniel's expression cooled noticeably. "I don't mean to be rude, but this is a family matter. You probably don't understand the complexities involved." "I understand that sometimes the most valuable things can't be measured in dollars," Lucy replied, evenly. "And I understand that your father loves this land more than his own comfort. Love doesn't pay foreclosure notices." Daniel shot back, his composure slipping slightly. "I've tried for years to get him to be practical about his situation. Now it may be too late for anything except damage control." Elias had remained silent through this exchange, but now he spoke with quiet authority. "The land isn't for sale, Daniel. Not to developers. Not for tourist operations, not for any price they might offer." "Then what's your plan?" Daniel's voice rose slightly, frustration breaking through his professional demeanor. "To lose everything because you're too stubborn to accept help? To accept the right kind of help," Elias replied, his gaze flickering toward Lucy. "From people who understand what this place means." The silence that followed was heavy with years of accumulated disappointment and misunderstanding. Lucy could see the pain in both men, Daniel's frustration with what he saw as his father's impracticality, and Elias's grief over his son's inability to value what couldn't be quantified in financial terms. "I should check on the steer," Lucy said quietly, recognizing that her presence was making an already difficult conversation more complicated. But as she turned to go, Jennifer spoke up. "Actually, could you show me around? I've never been on a working farm before." It was clearly an escape from the tension between father and son, but Lucy nodded gratefully. "Of course, we'll start with the barn." As they walked away, Lucy could hear the conversation continuing behind them, voices rising slightly as years of unspoken resentment began to surface. She focused on explaining the farm's operations to Jennifer, who proved to be genuinely curious. Despite her obvious discomfort with the rural setting, "Daniel doesn't talk much about growing up here," Jennifer said, as they watched the cattle grazing in the pasture. "I think it's painful for him." "Leaving family is always hard," Lucy replied diplomatically, "especially when the differences seem impossible to bridge. He feels like his father chose the farm over his children," Jennifer continued, lowering her voice. "When Daniel wanted to go to college, there was a big fight. His father said education would take him away from what mattered." Lucy absorbed this information, understanding more clearly now the source of the tension she had witnessed. And it did take him away, yes, but Daniel feels like that was the choice his father forced him to make. Either stay and accept a life he didn't want, or leave and lose his family. By the time they returned to the farmyard, the conversation between father and son had reached its inevitable conclusion. Daniel was already walking toward his truck, his face set in lines of familiar disappointment. "Think about what I said, Dad," he called back. "The offer won't stay open indefinitely." "He'll think about many things," Elias replied, but his tone suggested that the developer option wasn't among them. As the truck disappeared down the driveway, Lucy found herself standing beside Elias in the settling dust, both of them contemplating the complex pain of families, divided by different visions of what constituted a meaningful life. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "For what? For interfering. That wasn't my place." Elias was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the empty road where his son's truck had vanished. "Sometimes," he said finally, "we need someone to speak for what can't speak for itself. This land, this way of life, they have value beyond what shows up on a balance sheet." Lucy nodded, understanding that she had witnessed more than a family disagreement. She had seen the collision between two fundamentally different ways of measuring worth, and the heartbreak that resulted when people who loved each other couldn't find common ground. In the barn, she discovered something that made her breath catch: a wooden quilt frame, pushed into a corner and covered with dust. The craftsmanship was exquisite. The joints fitted so perfectly they seemed to flow together naturally. "Sarah's," Elias said, noticing her attention. "She spent winter evenings there, creating things of beauty, one small stitch at a time." Looking at the abandoned frame, Lucy saw more than unused equipment. She saw dreams interrupted, creative energy left unfulfilled, and the empty spaces that loss creates in even the most carefully ordered lives. But she also saw possibility. The storm arrived on a Thursday evening with the fury that only Pennsylvania summer weather could muster. Lucy was in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner when the first crack of thunder shook the farmhouse windows. She'd grown comfortable in the routine they'd established, working together through the day, sharing meals prepared from Sarah's recipes, and spending quiet evenings on the porch, discussing everything from veterinary techniques to the philosophical underpinnings of simple living. But this storm was different. The wind came first, bending the old oak trees until Lucy worried they might break, followed by rain that struck the windows like thrown gravel. Then came the hail, marble-sized at first, then growing to golf ball dimensions that drummed against the roof with alarming intensity. Elias stood at the kitchen window, his face grim as he watched the assault on his property. "We need to get to the barn," he said. "The animals will be terrified." They ran through the driving rain, Lucy's jacket providing little protection against the wind-driven precipitation. In the barn, they found the cattle huddled together, their eyes rolling, white with fear as thunder crashed overhead. The horses stamped and whinnied in their stalls, and even the usually placid dairy cows pressed against each other for comfort. "Easy, girls," Elias called out, his voice somehow carrying calm authority despite the chaos outside. Lucy marveled at how quickly the animals responded to his presence, their panic subsiding as he moved among them with steady confidence. The worst of the storm lasted nearly an hour, during which Lucy and Elias worked together to keep the animals calm and check for any damage to the barn structure. When the thunder finally began to move away and the hail diminished to ordinary rain, they ventured outside to assess what the storm had taken. The devastation was worse than Lucy had expected. The old oak that had provided shade for the cattle, lay across the pasture fence, its massive trunk crushing 20 feet of rails and posts. Part of the barn's roof had lifted away, leaving the hay storage exposed to the still falling rain. Most heartbreaking of all, one of the massive hand-hewn beams that supported the barn's main structure had cracked under the stress, threatening the stability of the entire building. "Oh, Elias," Lucy breathed, seeing the defeat in his shoulders. As he surveyed the damage, 40 years that beam has stood strong, he said quietly, running his hand along the crack that split the ancient timber. "My father chose that tree himself, cut it during the winter when the sap was down. He said it would last 100 years if we treated it right." Lucy studied the beam, noting how the crack ran nearly its full length, but didn't go completely through. Her veterinary training had taught her to assess structural damage in animals, bones, muscles, ligaments, and she applied that knowledge now to wood and joinery. "It's not as bad as it looks," she said carefully. "The crack is deep, but the beam is still sound. With the right bracing and some steel reinforcement, it could be stronger than before." Elias looked at her with surprise, then back at the damaged timber. "You think it can be saved?" "I think your father built something worth saving," Lucy replied. "The question is whether we can get the help we need to do it right." The answer came the next morning in the form of buggies and pickup trucks turning into the farmyard. Lucy watched from the kitchen window as neighbors arrived without invitation or fanfare, bringing tools and materials and the quiet determination that characterized the Amish response to community crisis. Rebecca Yoder was among the first to arrive, carrying a basket of food and wearing the practical dress of a woman prepared for hard work. She nodded politely to Lucy, but directed her questions to Elias, speaking in the mixture of English and Pennsylvania Dutch that marked intimate community conversation. "We heard about the storm damage," she said simply. "The men are coming after." They finished their morning chores. Within 2 hours, the farmyard had transformed into a hive of organized activity. Men examined the damaged beam and began the complex process of temporarily supporting the barn's weight while repairs were made. Women organized food and coordinated the logistics of feeding a work crew. Children helped where they could and stayed out of the way when necessary. Lucy found herself in an unusual position, welcomed for her practical skills, but clearly marked as an outsider by her English clothes and unfamiliarity with community protocols. She worked alongside the other women, grateful for tasks that didn't require cultural knowledge, but aware of the careful conversations that stopped when she approached. It was Rebecca Yoder who finally addressed the elephant in the room, approaching Lucy as she helped organize tools for the men working on the roof. "You've been here almost 2 weeks now," Rebecca said without preamble. "People are wondering about your intentions." Lucy set down the hammer she'd been sorting and looked directly at the older woman. "My intentions are to help Elias save his farm." And after that, the question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications Lucy wasn't sure she was ready to examine. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "I came here to keep a promise I made as a child. I didn't plan beyond that." Rebecca studied her face with the penetrating gaze of someone accustomed to reading character in difficult circumstances. "Elias is a good man who's had more than his share of sorrow. The community won't stand by and watch him be hurt by someone who's just passing through." "I'm not trying to hurt anyone," Lucy said quietly. "If anything, I'm trying to heal something, both for him and for myself." "Healing's good work," Rebecca acknowledged, "but it requires commitment that goes deeper than good intentions." Before Lucy could respond, a commotion from the barn drew their attention. The men had successfully raised the new support beam into position, but the process of securing it required precise coordination between multiple workers. Lucy watched Elias directing the operation, his knowledge of the barn's construction invaluable, despite his physical limitations. Then she saw him reach for his father's walking stick, leaning heavily on it as he moved to examine a particularly complex joint. The stick that had supported 3 generations of Stoltzfus men was now helping to preserve the barn they had built with their own hands. "That beam won't hold," called out one of the younger men, examining the crack with obvious concern. "It's compromised through too much of its length." "The crack doesn't go all the way through," Lucy said, stepping forward despite her awareness that her opinion might not be welcome. "If you brace it properly on both sides and run steel reinforcement along the fracture line, it could be even stronger than the original." The men looked at her with surprise, then at each other. This was technical knowledge crossing cultural boundaries, and Lucy held her breath while they considered her assessment. "She's right," said Samuel Byler, an older man whose reputation as a master carpenter carried weight in any construction discussion. "The wood's still sound where it counts. With proper reinforcement, that beam could outlast all of us." The work continued through the afternoon, with Lucy finding herself increasingly integrated into the community effort. Her medical knowledge proved valuable when young Jacob Miller cut his hand on a piece of metal roofing, and her suggestions about structural bracing were received with growing respect. As evening approached and the major repairs neared completion, Lucy realized something had shifted in the way the community viewed her presence. She was no longer just the Englishwoman who had appeared mysteriously in Elias's life. She had become someone who contributed meaningful skills to their collective effort. "You did good work today," Samuel told her as they cleaned up tools in the fading light. "That beam will hold now, stronger than before it was damaged." Lucy looked up at the massive timber, now secured with steel reinforcement and surrounded by additional support structures. It looked different than it had originally, marked by its encounter with disaster, but undeniably stronger for having survived the test. "Sometimes the broken places become the strongest parts," she said, thinking not just of wood and steel, but of hearts and lives that had been tested by loss. Samuel nodded approvingly. "That's wisdom worth remembering." As the last neighbors departed, and the farmyard returned to its normal quiet, Lucy and Elias stood together, surveying the day's accomplishments. The barn was not only repaired, but improved, its roof weather-tight and its structure more solid than it had been in years. "I couldn't have done this alone," Elias said quietly. "You didn't have to," Lucy replied. "That's what community means, no. One faces the storms alone." They stood in comfortable silence, both understanding that the day had accomplished more than building repairs. Lucy had been tested by the community and found worthy of their trust. More importantly, she had discovered that belonging wasn't just about accepting help. It was about contributing something valuable to the collective good. The damaged beam, now reinforced and stronger than ever, stood as a symbol of what could be accomplished when different kinds of knowledge worked together toward a common goal. The call came on a Tuesday morning, while Lucy was in the barn treating a minor case of mastitis in one of the younger cows. Her phone buzzed insistently against her hip and she almost ignored it. These days, the outside world felt increasingly distant and less important than the immediate needs of animals and land. But something made her glance at the screen. Doctor Margaret Chen, her former colleague from Colorado. Lucy hesitated, then stepped outside the barn to answer. "Lucy, I've been trying to reach you for weeks." Margaret's voice carried the familiar urgency of someone accustomed to making quick decisions. "Where have you been?" "Pennsylvania," Lucy replied, watching Elias emerge from the chicken coop with a basket of eggs. Even that simple sight had become dear to her, the careful way he moved among the birds, the gentle murmur of his voice as he spoke to them. "Pennsylvania? What on earth are you doing there?" Lucy found herself reluctant to explain, aware that her current life would sound inexplicable to someone from her former world. "It's complicated." "Well, uncomplicate yourself and get back here. I have news that's going to change everything." Margaret's excitement was infectious, despite Lucy's growing unease. "What kind of news?" "The position at Colorado State. The head of large animal medicine is retiring early, and they want to offer you the job. Lucy, this is what you've always wanted. Your own program, unlimited research funding, graduate students to mentor. They're prepared to make an offer that will set you up for life. The words hit Lucy like cold water. 6 months ago, this call would have been the answer to every professional dream she'd ever harbored. The chance to lead a prestigious veterinary program, to conduct research that could change animal care practices, to establish herself as a leader in her field. It represented everything she had worked towards since veterinary school. When do they need an answer? She heard herself asking. Soon. They want to announce the appointment before the fall semester. Lucy, you can't hesitate on something like this. Opportunities like this don't come twice. After the call ended, Lucy stood in the farmyard, holding her silent phone, feeling as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. The life she had built here over the past 2 weeks suddenly seemed fragile, temporary, a pleasant interlude rather, than a real foundation. Elias appeared beside her, his expression concerned. Bad news? Job offer, Lucy said, then immediately regretted her honesty when she saw his face change. His tone was carefully neutral. Good opportunity, the opportunity of a lifetime, Lucy replied, hating how the words sounded even as she spoke them. They worked through the morning in unusual quiet, both lost in thoughts they weren't ready to share. Lucy found herself paying attention to details she had taken for granted. The way morning light slanted through the barn windows, the comfortable rhythm of working alongside someone who understood the value of gentle hands and patient care, the deep satisfaction of tending creatures who asked for nothing more than competent attention. At lunch, eaten on the porch, as had become their custom, Elias finally broached the subject they had both been avoiding. "Tell me about this job offer." Lucy described the position, watching his face as she explained the prestige, the resources, the chance to influence veterinary education on a national level. With each detail, she saw him withdraw slightly, not from disappointment, but from a kind of resigned understanding. "It sounds like everything you trained for," he said when she finished. "It is. Then you have to consider it seriously." His acceptance stung worse than argument would have. "Do I?" "Lucy, you can't build a life around helping one old man save a failing farm. You have gifts that could benefit thousands of animals, hundreds of students. This is your calling. What if my calling has changed?" The question hung between them, carrying implications neither was ready to examine fully. Lucy felt exposed, having revealed more of her heart than she had intended. Elias studied her face with the careful attention he gave to injured animals, looking for signs of distress or healing. "Callings don't change," he said gently, "but sometimes we understand them better." That afternoon, Lucy found herself restless, unable to concentrate on routine tasks. She wandered through the farm, seeing it with new eyes, not just as a place that needed her help, but as a place she had grown to love. The discovery surprised her with its intensity. When had this happened? When had the farm stopped being a temporary refuge and started feeling like home? She ended up in the unused section of the barn, where Sarah's quilt frame sat covered in dust. Acting on impulse, Lucy pulled away the covering and examined the beautiful craftsmanship more closely. The wood was smooth from years of use, the joints fitted with the precision that marked generations of careful workmanship. In one of the drawers beneath the frame, she found something that made her breath catch, a partially completed quilt top. In shades of blue and white, the pattern complex and beautiful. Accompanying it was a small notebook filled with Sarah's careful handwriting, documenting the story behind each fabric piece. "Blue from Hannah's christening dress," read one entry, "white from my mother's wedding sheets, dark blue from Daniel's first school shirt." This was more than a quilt. It was a family history told in fabric, a tangible record of lives lived and loved. At the bottom of the notebook, in different ink, as if added later, Sarah had written, "For the daughter I never had, when she comes home." Lucy sank onto a nearby crate, the notebook trembling in her hands. Had Sarah somehow known? Had she sensed, even during that long-ago summer, that the little girl asking endless questions would one day need a place to belong? She started that. After you visited, Lucy looked up to find Elias standing in the doorway, his expression soft with memory. I don't understand. The quilt. Sarah began it the winter after you were here. Said she had a feeling you'd be back someday, and she wanted to have something beautiful waiting for you. But she didn't know me. Not really. Elias stepped closer, his gaze taking in the quilt pieces scattered across the frame. Sarah had a gift for seeing people's hearts, especially wounded ones. That summer, she watched you absorb everything about our life here like you were starving for it. She told me you were a child looking for home. Lucy felt tears she hadn't expected burning behind her eyes. I was 7 years old. I didn't know I was looking for anything. Sometimes the heart knows. Things the mind hasn't figured out yet. Elias picked up one of the quilt pieces, a soft blue square cut from fabric worn smooth by loving use. After Sarah got sick, she asked me to promise that if you ever came back, I'd make sure you knew you belonged here. The weight of revelation settled over Lucy like a physical presence. This wasn't just about keeping a childhood promise or helping an aging farmer save his land. This was about a woman she barely remembered seeing something in her that she hadn't seen in herself, a longing for roots, for purpose that went deeper than professional achievement, for the kind of belonging that came not from earning it, but from being chosen. She kept hoping you'd come while she was still alive, Elias continued. Near the end, when the pain was bad, she'd talk about the quilt she was making for Lucy. It gave her something to focus on besides the hurt. I should have come sooner, Lucy whispered, understanding now that her arrival had been 17 years too late for the most important introduction. You came when you needed to, Elias said, with the gentle certainty that marked all his deepest beliefs. And when I needed you to. Sarah would say that's how God's timing works. Lucy looked around the barn, seeing not just a building but a repository of love and loss, dreams deferred and promises kept. The life she had built in Colorado seemed suddenly thin by comparison, professionally successful but emotionally hollow, full of achievement but empty of the connections that gave achievement. Meaning, I have to make a decision about the job, she said quietly. Yes, you do. What would you do? Elias was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from the unfinished quilt to Lucy's face. I can't make that choice for you, but I can tell you that some opportunities come once in a lifetime, and others come once in a lifetime too. The question is, which kind of once in a lifetime matters more to your heart? As evening fell and they completed the day's chores together, Lucy felt the pull of competing futures. One path led back to the world she had trained for, to recognition and influence, and the kind of success that looked impressive from the outside. The other led deeper into this place that had somehow become precious to her, into a life measured not by professional advancement, but by the daily acts of care that kept living things thriving. That night, lying in her bed at the local inn, Lucy pulled out her wallet and found herself staring at something she had hidden even from herself. Tucked behind her driver's license was an ultrasound photo, edges worn from handling, the image barely visible after years of being carried like a talisman of loss. She had never told anyone about the baby she had lost, not even David, who had been traveling when the miscarriage happened. The grief had been hers, alone to carry, along with the dreams of nurturing something small and precious, of being needed in the most fundamental way possible. Looking at the faded image, Lucy understood something about herself that she had been afraid to acknowledge. Her return to this farm wasn't just about keeping a childhood promise. It was about finding a place where her capacity for care could flourish, where the maternal instincts she had buried could find expression in tending land and animals, and a gentle man who had forgotten how to let himself be cared for. The job in Colorado offered professional fulfillment, but it would never heal the hollow place in her heart that yearned to nurture, to belong, to be essential to someone's daily happiness. Some choices, Lucy realized, weren't really choices at all. They were recognitions of what had always been. True, The farm deed lay spread across Elias's kitchen table like a map of everything that mattered to him. Lucy sat across from him in the early morning light, both of them nursing cups of coffee that had grown cold as they pored over the legal document that represented 4 generations of Stoltzfus family legacy. 87 acres, Elias said quietly, his finger tracing the property boundaries outlined in precise legal language. My great-grandfather bought this land with money he saved for 10 years, working other men's farms until he could afford his own. Lucy studied the deed, noting the careful handwriting of men who had signed their names to something that would outlast their lifetimes. The document was more than paperwork. It was a covenant between family and land, a promise to tend and preserve what had been entrusted to their care. The bank would let you keep the house and 5 acres, she said, referencing the latest conversation she'd had with Tom Fletcher. You could still have a garden, maybe a few chickens. 5 acres. Elias shook his head with quiet resignation. Might as well be a postage stamp. What kind of farming can a man do on 5 acres? The kind that keeps you fed and housed without the burden of maintaining something this large, Lucy replied, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke. They had been having variations of this conversation for 3 days, ever since Margaret Chen's call had forced them both to confront the reality of their situation. Lucy's job offer had a deadline, and Elias's financial crisis wasn't going to resolve itself through wishful thinking. Something had to give, and both of them were running out of time to decide what it would be. I called the university yesterday, Lucy said quietly. Elias looked up sharply. And asked for more time to consider. They gave me until Friday. That's only 3 days away. I know. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken implications. Lucy had thrown herself into farm work with renewed intensity over the past few days, as if physical labor could somehow solve the emotional complexity of her situation. She had reorganized the medical supplies, implemented a preventive care schedule for the livestock, and even begun preliminary sketches for expanding the vegetable garden. Each project felt simultaneously essential and futile, necessary for the farm's improvement, but potentially irrelevant if she wasn't going to be here to see them through. You have to take the job, Elias said suddenly, his voice carrying the forced conviction of someone trying to convince himself as much as her. This opportunity, it's everything you've worked for. Is it? Lucy pushed back from the table, restless energy making it impossible to sit still. A year ago, I would have said yes without hesitation. But now you're thinking with your heart instead of your head. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. Elias studied her face, seeing the conflict that she was trying so hard to hide. Lucy, I've watched you work with the animals, seen how you approach problems, listened to you talk about veterinary medicine. You have a gift that could benefit thousands of creatures. How can you consider wasting that on one old man's failing? Farm. It wouldn't be wasted, Lucy said fiercely. Everything I've learned, everything I can do, it all matters here too. Maybe not on the same scale, but what? You'll spend your career treating a handful of cattle and chickens when you could be advancing the entire field of veterinary medicine. The argument was logical, practical, and completely at odds with what Lucy's heart was telling her. She moved to the window, looking out at the pasture where the cattle grazed peacefully in the morning sun. Bertha was among them, her hoof completely healed now, moving easily across the grass that Elias had spent 4 decades learning to tend. What if scale isn't the only measure of importance? She asked quietly. What if doing something well with love in one small place matters as much as changing the world? That's a beautiful sentiment, Elias replied, but it won't pay your student loans or build you a retirement fund, and it won't save this farm either. The harsh truth of his words hit harder because Lucy knew he was right about the practical realities. Her presence here had improved the farm's immediate operations, but it hadn't solved the fundamental financial crisis. Even if she stayed, Even if she somehow figured out a way to make the monthly payments, they would still be operating on margins too thin for security. "I've been thinking about that," Lucy said, turning back from the window. "About the finances." She pulled a folder from the kitchen counter, spreading her own carefully prepared documents across the table beside the farm deed. "I ran the numbers based on what we've accomplished in 2 weeks, projected out over a full year." Elias leaned forward, his expression skeptical but interested. "With proper veterinary care, we could increase the herd size safely. Your cows are healthy, but you're not maximizing their potential because you've been treating problems reactively instead of preventing them proactively. With a structured breeding program, we could improve milk production by 20% within 2 years. That's assuming we can afford to buy more cattle. We start small, reinvest profits, build gradually. And there are other opportunities." Lucy pointed to another section of her analysis. "The market for organic, grass-fed beef is strong in this area. We could transition part of the herd to beef production, command premium prices from restaurants and farmers' markets." Elias studied her projections with growing interest. The numbers were conservative but optimistic, based on solid agricultural principles rather than wishful thinking. "You've put a lot of work into this," he said quietly. "I wanted to see if it was possible, if there was a way to make this place not just survive, but thrive." "And your conclusion?" Lucy hesitated, knowing that her next words would reveal more about her feelings than any direct declaration. "My conclusion is that it's absolutely possible, but only if we're both committed to making it work. This isn't something one person can do alone." The pronoun hung in the air between them. "We, us, our shared future." Lucy felt exposed, having laid out not just financial projections, but the shape of the life she was imagining for herself. "Lucy, I know what you're going to say," she interrupted, "that I'm being impractical, that I'm giving up too much for too little return. But what if the return isn't measured in dollars? What if it's measured in something else entirely?" Before Elias could respond, the sound of a car in the driveway drew their attention. Through the kitchen window, they saw Daniel's pickup truck, but this time he was alone. No fiancé, no formal clothes, just a man in work jeans who looked as if he hadn't slept well in several days. "Dad!" Daniel called as he approached the house. "We need to talk." Lucy started to excuse herself, but Daniel shook his head. "Actually, I'd like you to stay if you don't mind. This involves you too." They gathered around the kitchen table, the farm deed still spread between them like evidence in a trial. Daniel's eyes took in Lucy's financial projections, the carefully prepared plans for the farm's future. "I owe you both an apology," he began without preamble. "I came here last week with an offer I thought was generous, but I realize now I was trying to solve the wrong problem." Elias waited, his expression guarded. "I thought Dad's problem was the farm, that it was too much work, too much responsibility, too much financial burden. So I found a way to eliminate the farm." Daniel paused, his voice growing quieter. "But the farm isn't the problem. The farm is everything that gives his life meaning. Taking that away wouldn't solve anything. It would destroy everything." Lucy felt a flutter of hope, but kept her expression neutral. "I talked to Jennifer about what we saw here," Daniel continued. "About the way you two worked together, the way the community rallied to help with the storm damage, the way Dad's face changed when he was showing off the improvements you've made." "What are you saying?" Elias asked carefully. "I'm saying I was wrong. About the developers, about selling the land, about everything." Daniel pulled a folded check from his shirt pocket, setting it on the table beside the other documents. "This won't solve all your problems, but it'll buy you time to implement whatever plan you're working on." Lucy stared at the check, noting the amount that would cover several months of mortgage payments. "Daniel, I can't accept—" "Yes, you can," Daniel interrupted. "It's not charity, Dad. It's an investment in something I should have valued from the beginning. And it's an apology for not understanding that some things matter more than their market value." The conversation that followed was halting, emotional, marked by years of misunderstanding being slowly untangled. Daniel spoke of feeling pushed away by expectations he couldn't meet, while Elias acknowledged that his fear of losing his son had driven them further apart. Lucy watched the careful process of reconciliation begin, understanding that some healings took time to unfold. "There's something else," Daniel said as their conversation wound down. "Jennifer and I have been talking about what we really want, and from life. The city, the corporate job, the apartment we can barely afford, it's not making us happy. We were wondering if there might be a place for us here, not to take over, but to be part of something that matters." The possibility hung in the air like a bridge being built between two worlds. Lucy saw the longing in Elias's face, the hope he was afraid to acknowledge. "There's always room for family," Elias said quietly. "If you're sure that's what you want, we're—" "Sure," Daniel replied. "It just took us a while to understand what we were looking for." After Daniel left, promising to return the following week to begin planning their transition, Lucy and Elias sat in the kitchen surrounded by the documents that mapped out several possible futures. The immediate financial crisis was eased. The prospect of family reconciliation was real, and the farm's long-term viability seemed more achievable than it had in years. "So," Elias said quietly, "what are you going to tell the university?" Lucy looked at the farm deed, at her own carefully prepared projections, at the check that represented Daniel's change of heart. Then she looked at Elias, seeing not just an aging farmer who needed help, but a man who had become central to every future she could imagine for herself. "I'm going to tell them," she said, feeling certainty settle in her chest like warmth, "that I've found something better than the opportunity of a lifetime. I've found the life of a lifetime." The smile that transformed Elias's face was worth more than any professional recognition she might have earned. The morning of Lucy's deadline dawned clear and still, the kind of Pennsylvania summer day that made the countryside look like a painting come to life. She woke before her alarm, dressed quietly, and drove to the farm through air so fresh it seemed to carry promises of its own. She found Elias in the barn as usual, but this morning he was standing perfectly still beside Bertha's stall, his hands resting on the worn wood, as if drawing strength from the connection to something solid and enduring. He looked up when she entered, his expression carrying the weight of decisions that would shape both their futures. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked softly. "Too much thinking," Lucy admitted, moving to stand beside him. In the weeks since her arrival, this space had become sacred to her, the barn where they had learned to work together, where trust had been built through shared labor and quiet conversation. "I have something to show you," Elias said, reaching into his shirt pocket. He pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and worn soft at the edges. "Found this last night when I was going through Sarah's things." Lucy unfolded the paper carefully, her breath catching when she recognized her own 7-year-old handwriting. It was a letter, written in the careful block letters of a child determined to get every word right. "Dear Mr. Elias and Mrs. Sarah, thank you for showing me your farm and teaching me about taking care of things. I liked milking the cows and feeding the chickens and helping fix the gate. I want to be a veterinarian when I grow up so I can take care of animals like you do. I promise I will come back and help on your farm when I am big enough. I will not forget. Love, Lucy Brennan, P.S. I hope Bessie has a good calf." Lucy stared at the letter, memories flooding back with startling clarity. She remembered writing it at the kitchen table in their rental house, carefully choosing each word while her parents packed for their departure. She had intended to mail it, but had forgotten in the chaos of childhood travels and new experiences. "You never sent this," Elias observed gently. "I meant to, but—" Lucy shook her head, amazed by the child she had been. "I can't believe you kept it all these years. Sarah found it in your room after you left, said it was the most precious thing anyone had ever written to her." Elias took the letter back, handling it with the reverence due to sacred documents. She used to read it when she was feeling low, said it reminded her that some promises are bigger than the people who make them. They stood in comfortable silence, both contemplating the mystery of connections that transcended time and distance. Outside, the farm was coming alive with the sounds of morning. Cattle lowing softly, chickens beginning their daily commentary, the distant hum of traffic on the county road that connected this peaceful place to the larger world. "I called the university an hour ago," Lucy said quietly. Elias turned sharply, his face showing alarm. "Lucy, if you've made a decision you'll regret—" "I told them no," she continued, feeling the rightness of the words settle in her chest like coming home. "I thank Dr. Chen for thinking of me, wish them well in finding the right person for the position, and declined their offer." The relief that flooded Elias's expression was quickly followed by concern. "Are you certain? Once you've said no to something like that, there will be other opportunities," Lucy interrupted gently. "Maybe not exactly like this one, but other chances to use my skills in ways that matter. The question is whether there will be another chance to build the kind of life I want in a place where I belong." She gestured around the barn, taking in the familiar sights and smells that had become dear to her. "This is where I belong, Elias. Not because it's easy or convenient or professionally advantageous, but because this is where my heart feels at home. Even knowing the challenges we'll face, the financial uncertainty, the hard work, the way some people will always see you as an outsider, especially knowing those things," Lucy replied with conviction. "I'm not looking for easy anymore. I'm looking for meaningful. And nothing I could accomplish in Colorado would be more meaningful than what we're building here." Elias folded the childhood letter carefully, returning it to his pocket where it would rest close to his heart. "Sarah always said you'd come back. When we needed you most. I thought she meant when I needed help with the farm. What do you think she meant now?" "I think she meant when we both needed to remember what it feels like to choose love over fear, community over isolation, the harder path that leads somewhere worth going." The words hung between them, carrying implications that neither had been ready to acknowledge until this moment. Lucy felt the shift in the air, the sense that they were approaching something that would change everything. "Elias," she began, then stopped, suddenly uncertain how to voice what was in her heart. "I know," he said quietly, understanding passing between them without need for explicit words. "I feel it too." The barn around them seemed to hold its breath, as if the very structure that had witnessed 4 generations of Stoltzfus family life was waiting to see what new chapter would begin within its walls. In the soft morning light, with the promise of a shared future shimmering between them, like heat rising from summer fields, Lucy understood that some decisions were not made with the mind, but recognized by the heart. Her childhood promise had been kept, but it had grown into something larger and more beautiful than her 7-year-old self could have imagined. The community gathered on a Saturday morning in late June, drawn not by formal invitation, but by the invisible network of shared purpose that connected neighbor to neighbor across the Amish countryside. Lucy watched from the farmhouse porch as buggies and pickup trucks filled the yard, bringing faces that had become familiar over her weeks of belonging to this place. Rebecca Yoder emerged from her buggy, carrying a covered dish and wearing an expression of barely contained satisfaction. Samuel Byler supervised the unloading of lumber from his truck, calling out instructions in the mixture of English and Pennsylvania Dutch that marked important community work. Even some of the younger families had come, children racing between the adults' legs while their parents organized tools and materials. "What's all this about?" Lucy asked Elias, who stood beside her with his own expression of pleased bewilderment. "Community has its own ways of celebrating," he replied cryptically, but the smile tugging at the corners of his mouth suggested he knew more than he was letting on. The answer became clear when Samuel approached the porch, carrying a wooden sign, freshly painted and gleaming in the morning sun. The craftsmanship was exquisite. hand-carved letters filled with paint the color of growing things, bordered with simple but elegant designs that spoke of tradition, honored, and future embraced. Stoltzfus and Brennan Family Farm, Lucy read aloud, her voice catching slightly on the words that made their partnership official in the way that mattered most to this community. "The name's not quite right yet," Rebecca said, with the directness that Lucy had learned to appreciate, "but it's what we're working toward." Heat rose to Lucy's cheeks as the implications settled over her. The community had taken it upon themselves to acknowledge what she and Elias were still learning to admit, that their partnership had grown beyond convenience or necessity into something that deserved recognition and celebration. "We figured it was time this place had a proper sign," Samuel explained, gesturing toward the weathered post by the road where no marker had stood for years. "A farm that's going to thrive needs people to know it's here." The work of installing the sign became a celebration in itself. Men dug the post hole with the precision born of generations of fence-building experience, while women organized a feast on tables set up in the shade of the old oak tree. Children helped where they could and played where they couldn't. Their laughter adding music to the morning's purpose, Lucy found herself moving between groups, accepted now with the easy inclusion that marked true belonging. She helped arrange food, answered questions about the farm's improvement plans, and gradually understood that this gathering was more than sign installation. It was the community's formal recognition of her place among them. "You've found your way home," Martha Byler said quietly, appearing beside Lucy as they watched the men position the new sign. Martha was Samuel's wife, a woman whose quiet wisdom carried weight in community decisions. "It feels that way," Lucy agreed, watching Elias guide the sign into perfect alignment with the patient attention he brought to everything that mattered. "Home isn't always the place you're born," Martha continued. "Sometimes it's the place you choose, and that chooses you back." As the sign settled into position, held steady by fresh concrete and community blessing, Daniel's pickup truck pulled into the already crowded driveway. He and Jennifer emerged, carrying their own contributions to the feast, their faces showing the nervous anticipation of people hoping for acceptance. The community's welcome was immediate and warm. Jennifer found herself absorbed into the women's conversation, her city background becoming an asset, as she shared different perspectives on everything from gardening techniques to child-rearing philosophy. Daniel worked alongside his father for the first time in years, their shared labor creating bridges that words alone couldn't build. "This is how it should have been all along," Elias said quietly, watching his son laugh at something Samuel had said while they leveled the signpost. "Maybe it had to be this way," Lucy replied. "Maybe all of us needed to find our own paths before we could appreciate coming home." The afternoon stretched long and golden, filled with the kind of contentment that came from meaningful work, completed in good company. As the sun began its descent toward the western hills, the crowd gradually dispersed, leaving behind not just a newly marked farm, but a sense of future possibilities made tangible. Lucy and Elias stood together in the settling quiet, looking at their new sign as evening light caught the painted letters. "Stoltzfus and Brennan Family Farm," announced to anyone who passed that this place belonged to people who belonged to each other. "The community has spoken," Elias said with gentle humor. "Seems they have expectations about our future." "What kind of expectations?" Lucy asked, though she suspected she knew. "The kind that involve making the sign accurate in every particular," he replied, turning to face her with an expression that mixed nervousness with hope. "Lucy, I know we haven't talked about, that is, I don't want to assume." She silenced him with a gentle touch to his arm. "Elias, I gave up a career in Colorado to stay here. I think my intentions are fairly clear. Clear enough for an old farmer to hope, clear enough for this farmer's partner to say yes before you. Even ask the question." The kiss that followed was gentle, sweet, and witnessed by the farm that had brought them together. Around them, the land that 4 generations of Stoltzfus men had tended seemed to exhale with satisfaction, as if the earth itself approved of this new chapter in its long story. Their new sign stood straight and proud against the evening sky, a promise made visible to all who passed that some things were worth preserving, some partnerships were worth celebrating, and some promises, made by children or confirmed by adults, were meant to last a lifetime. 1 year later, Lucy knelt in the corner of the farmhouse parlor, carefully stitching the final border of the quilt that had waited 17 years for completion. The pattern Sarah had begun, wedding ring symbolizing eternal love and unbroken promises, now told the story of multiple journeys home. Lucy's return to the place that had shaped her heart, Daniel and Jennifer's discovery of lives worth living, and Elias's emergence from grief into renewed purpose. The morning sun streamed through windows that now bore curtains Lucy had sewn herself, following patterns found in Sarah's recipe box, alongside instructions for more traditional nourishment. The house that had echoed with emptiness a year ago now hummed with the quiet activity of people building a life together. "Almost finished?" Elias asked, settling into the chair beside her with 2 cups of coffee, prepared the way she liked it. A small intimacy that spoke of habits formed through daily care. "Last few stitches," Lucy replied, holding up the section she'd been working on. The blues and whites that Sarah had chosen told their story in fabric. Pieces from Daniel's childhood clothes, squares cut from his grandmother's aprons, and new additions Lucy had contributed, fabric from her own past, integrated seamlessly with the family history that had welcomed her. "She knew," Elias said quietly, running his fingers along one of the finished sections. "Somehow, Sarah knew you'd be here to complete it." Lucy considered this, no longer surprised by the mysterious workings of hearts that recognized their destinations long before minds caught up. The quilt had become more than decoration. It was proof that some stories were meant to unfold across time, connecting past and future through threads of love and patience. Through the kitchen window, she could see Daniel and Jennifer working. In the expanded vegetable garden, their movements coordinated by months of shared labor. They had moved into the small apartment above the barn, close enough to be helpful, but separate enough to build their own version of the family tradition. Jennifer had surprised everyone, including herself, by taking to farm life with enthusiasm that bordered on passion. Her background in business had proved invaluable in marketing their organic produce, while Daniel's engineering skills had improved efficiency in everything from irrigation to barn ventilation. "The McKinnon farm came up for sale yesterday," Elias mentioned casually, though Lucy caught the undertone of possibility in his voice. "The dairy operation." Lucy looked up from her stitching, immediately understanding the implications. The McKinnon place bordered their eastern property line, with good pasture and a barn that could house their expanding herd. "Samuel thinks we could manage it. With the improvements we've made here, the community would help with financing." Lucy set down her needle, her mind already calculating possibilities. Their own farm had exceeded every projection she'd made. That desperate morning a year ago, the combination of her veterinary expertise, Elias's deep knowledge of the land, and Daniel's modern sensibilities had created something greater than the sum of its parts. They were not only meeting their mortgage payments, but beginning to build reserves for expansion. "What do you think?" she asked. "I think," Elias said slowly, "that a year ago I was ready to give up on dreams I'd carried for 40 years. Now I'm dreaming bigger than I ever imagined possible." A knock at the front door interrupted their planning, followed by Rebecca Yoder's familiar voice calling out a greeting. Lucy smiled, recognizing the particular tone that meant their neighbor was bursting with news too important to wait for formal visits. "Come see what arrived," Rebecca announced, practically bouncing with excitement as she led them to the front porch. A delivery truck was pulling away from their mailbox, leaving behind a small wooden crate marked with careful handling instructions. Inside, nestled in. Protective padding. Lucy found a brass nameplate engraved with elegant script. Dr. Lucy Brennan Stoltzfus, Doctor of Veterinary Medicine. "For your office door," Rebecca explained, beaming with satisfaction. "Now that you're official." The Pennsylvania Veterinary Licensing Board had approved Lucy's application to establish a large animal practice based at the farm. Word had spread quickly through the rural community that Dr. Stoltzfus, the name she would take after their wedding next month, was accepting patients. Her appointment book was already filled with farmers grateful to have quality veterinary care available locally. "It's beautiful," Lucy said, running her fingers over the engraved letters that made her new life official in ways that mattered to the larger world. "It's accurate," Elias corrected gently, his arms settling around her waist with the natural ease of long partnership. "Dr. Lucy Brennan Stoltzfus, veterinarian, farmer, and keeper of promises." That evening, as had become their custom, they sat on the porch swing, watching fireflies begin their nightly dance over the pasture. The quilt lay completed across Lucy's lap, ready to grace the bed they would soon share as husband and wife. In her pocket, carefully preserved, was the ultrasound photo she no longer needed to hide. Grief transformed into hope for the family they would build together, whether through children of their own or the extended family of community and land that had already claimed them. "Are you happy?" Elias asked, the question carrying undertones of wonder, as if he still couldn't quite believe the transformation a single year had brought. Lucy looked across the farm that had become home, at the cattle grazing peacefully in pastures green with summer abundance, at the garden where Daniel and Jennifer were finishing the day's harvest, at the barn where 4 generations of careful work continued under her gentle stewardship. "I'm home," she replied, understanding finally that happiness was not a feeling to be pursued, but a byproduct of living in alignment with one's deepest truths. The quilt in her lap caught the last rays of sunlight, its pattern of interlocking rings creating shadows that danced across the porch like promises made visible. Some circles took 17 years to complete, Lucy thought, but when they finally closed, they held everything that mattered within their perfect, unbroken embrace. In the distance, the evening bells of the Amish church began to ring, calling the community to vespers and reminding all who heard them that the most important promises were the ones that lasted long enough to become part of the eternal story woven through ordinary days by extraordinary love.